Welcome to 5 Smooth Stones for Spiritual Formation. My name is Gary Selby and I teach ministry here at Emmanuel Christian Seminary. I'm thrilled to partner with our Ministry Resource Center to make a little of what happens in our classrooms available to you wherever you're doing ministry. This series is about spiritual formation, what it is, what shapes it, what its outcomes might be. What I'm going to try to do is give you a set of basic axioms that you can build on to nurture spiritual formation in a variety of settings. You might think about it in terms of learning to cook. One way of learning to cook is to get a good recipe book that will take you step by step through some recipes. But another approach is to learn some fundamental principles of cooking, sort of like what you get in the book and video series Fat, Salt, Acid, and Heat. You learn how fat affects flavor and texture, what salt or acids such as lemon or vinegar do for a dish, and how varying heat affects the food that you're cooking. You don't come away with a specific recipe, but you're prepared to begin creating tasty dishes. In the same way, some treatments of spiritual formation are like recipe books. They give you detailed information about particular forms or practices of spirituality, and that's completely legitimate. They're so helpful. But what I want to do is a bit more like the fat, salt, acid, heat approach, to give you a sensitivity to some important principles of formation that can shape all that you do in your ministry. And so let's get started. I'd like to begin by telling you about a strange experience I had about 2 months into the pandemic. We had shifted classes online, most businesses and public spaces were shuttered, and we were faithfully practicing the discipline that had newly become part of our cultural lexicon, social distancing. It seemed like COVID-19 was all we talked about, all we read about in the news, and it occupied every waking thought and even many of our dreams. At about the same time that all this was happening, I was reading a mystery novel set in World War II London. And I came to a point in the story when a mass of city residents began crowding into Westminster Cathedral for a prayer service. I immediately felt a visceral sense of shock and panic welling up inside of me. I felt the urge to shout at these fictional characters, "What are you doing? Don't you know that we're in the middle of a pandemic?" My reaction was unsought, unplanned, completely visceral. It didn't reflect a rational thinking process, but instead simply arose from somewhere deep within me. The reality of our predicament, the danger of the COVID-19 virus, and the dire need for taking safety precautions had simply become entrenched in my pre-reflective sense of the world. I didn't have to think about it, it just came over me. That experience gives us a sense of what we're talking about when we talk about being spiritually formed. We're talking about the processes by which we develop stable and enduring attitudes, dispositions, gut-level orientations to the world. I especially want to emphasize how this orientation resides at the gut level. Here's what I mean. We don't usually articulate it explicitly, but all of us have a sense of what life is all about, what constitutes the good life, what really matters, even down to the way that being successful usually means having more money or stuff next year than we had this year. We all have deeply held assumptions about the world, whether life is good or not, whether the world is welcoming or not, whether people can be trusted or not. When we see people who are different from us or who are members of a different cultural or ethnic group from our own, we inescapably have a gut level reaction to them. We don't usually articulate or even think about how we come up with that reaction. It just bubbles up from within. Here's another thing about that gut level sense of the world. It doesn't always line up with what we say we believe about God and about ourselves and about other people. We say we believe God is in control. We say that God loves everyone equally. We say that what counts is for God's will to be done. But watch what we do when we're under stress or in the middle of conflict or facing crisis and tragedy. Often in those moments, what we really believe about the world comes out. And it's often very distressing. In the same way that I had that spontaneous reaction to an image of all those people crowding into Westminster Cathedral, we have been formed or shaped to respond to the world viscerally, as much out of our guts as out of any rational thinking process. And so when we speak of Christian spiritual formation, this is ultimately what we're talking about. Having that deep, usually inarticulate sense of the world shaped in such a way that reflects the character of Christ. Now, in coming presentations, we'll talk some more about the processes by which our sense of the world is shaped. But for now, let's focus on the outcome of that process, what we might call a Christian social imaginary. That phrase, social imaginary, comes to us from a philosopher named Charles Taylor. He's a deeply influential figure in contemporary thought. When Taylor talks about the social imaginary, he's trying to take us beyond what he calls the intellectual schemes we come up with when we try to step back from the world and describe it in abstract or theoretical terms. Instead, he says, it's like we have this broad, largely unstructured and inarticulate understanding of our whole situation. And within that sense of the world, things make sense. We know what's expected of us. We know what to expect of other people, why things happen the way they do, and so forth. As an example, imagine walking into some kind of informal public gathering, maybe a reception, a church get-together, and you look around and you see a couple of people talking together who are acquaintances of yours. And so you walk up to them and join the conversation. For the most part, you don't think about it. You don't consult a little rule book on the appropriate things to say or how to hold your body or anything like that. You just do it because you know how to do it. You have this sense of how it all works and when to jump in, and also a sense of how other people respond to you when you do. It's all internal, unarticulated, we just know. Taylor compares it to the way we might know the neighborhood we grew up in. I grew up in Crestview Estates, a development in suburban Maryland. And I could get anywhere in that neighborhood. I knew the best places to ride a bike, the best sledding hills, where to go if I wanted to throw a football around with my friends, how to get to school, how to get to the new construction sites where we would pick up returnable Coke bottles for a refund. I could get to Kenny's house and Pam's house and Jeff's house. I also knew the places to avoid, where those people lived who didn't like kids running through their yard. Now, I didn't know the street names. I'd never looked at a map. And I would have struggled to articulate directions if you had asked, but I could have taken you anywhere because that sense of the neighborhood was so deeply imprinted on my psyche. This is what we're talking about when we talk about our gut reactions to the world. Here's another way of thinking about it from the man widely considered to be the dean of African American preaching, Henry Mitchell. He uses the metaphor of tapes to capture this understanding of spiritual formation as a transformation process that reconstitutes one's whole mode of being, he says, that brings one's core beliefs and entire style of living closer and closer to the new person in Christ. The image, of course, is of a tape recorder, or to update the illustration, a smartphone or a personal device, on which have been recorded the impressions and experiences that shape what he calls our intuitive consciousness. Like Taylor, he emphasizes that most of our actions and reactions come not from overt reasoning processes, but rather they spring from this intuitive region. It's the place where we've stored impressions and tastes, our memories of how important people in our lives have modeled social interactions. It's where we store our prejudices, our unspoken expectations of the world, our sense of ourselves. It's also the place that contains the common sense wisdom. Taylor calls this the hometown know-how that we use to move through the world. As Chris Thurman emphasized in his book, The Lies We Believe, sometimes those tapes that hum along just beneath the surface of our consciousness are unhealthy and destructive. They are lies that say things like, I must be perfect, or I can't be happy unless things go my way, or life shouldn't be difficult, or the one that I have typically had rolling in an endless loop in my own brain, which is the one that says, I must have everyone's approval. Our tapes can include memories of past failures and regrets. They contain the messages that important people in our lives have given us about ourselves. They include cultural expectations about identity and success and worth that we've been socialized to believe. And so our challenge is to find ways to support God's work of rewriting the tapes. Well, how does that happen? We find a clue in the ministry of Jesus. Here's just one example. In Matthew 15, he talks about being clean and unclean, and he stresses that these aren't primarily about ritual defilement. Instead, they have to do with what's going on deep inside, in our hearts, we might say in our guts. For, he says, what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, for out of the heart come evil intentions. And then, in the very next episode, Jesus gathers his disciples and they walk together up the Mediterranean coast to the city of Tyre, which was a heavily Gentile area. And there they encounter the Syrophoenician woman, a non-Jew, who kneels before Jesus and begs him to heal her daughter. She represents an ethnicity toward which most Jews at the time would have felt disdain. She was unclean. And Jesus gives voice to the deep prejudice his disciples would have carried in his jarring response to her. It is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. Why would Jesus say something like this? Well, one strong possibility is that he was taking his disciples bodily into a social encounter that would challenge their deep prejudice toward women and toward non-Jews. He names the thoughts and feelings that had instantaneously welled up within them at the sight of this woman. And then he challenges that response by honoring her boldness in words that his disciples could scarcely have imagined would ever come from the lips of Israel's Messiah. He exclaims, "Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish." Maybe Jesus knew that the only way his disciples would ever be prepared to bring good news to all the nations would be for them to have their gut-level reactions to both women and people of other ethnicities fundamentally challenged. And the only way that would happen would be for them to be put in situations where they were given a chance to act out this new way of being. This example gives us a glimpse into some of the things that go into our formation. It's a social process. It involves other people. It's experiential. It's developed through habitual practice. And it often involves our bodies as well as our minds. But for now, I just want to emphasize this insight. Most of what we do, our sense of identity, our reactions to the world and to other people, our capacity to deal with disappointment, our sense of what life is all about and what constitutes living well, all of these spring from our gut sense of the world, from what Charles Taylor called the social imaginary. And so this is the challenge of spiritual formation, to reach down to what Henry Mitchell called our intuitive consciousness, or to use the language of Ephesians, for the eyes of our hearts to be opened and enlightened so that we might know God's love in our inner being. This is where all that we do by way of discipleship or formation must lead, toward the development of a holistic, all-encompassing way of being in the world that is fundamentally Christian, where God is truly all in all. Thanks for listening.